James Fodor, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Hmm. Okay, can you tell me about yourself?
Sure. Well, I am a PhD student studying cognitive science and neuroscience of language. I was raised as a Mormon, a Latter-day Saint. Don't know if you know much about that, but that's a heterodox strand of Christianity. I left that when I was around 20 years old, but since then I've developed a pretty keen interest in philosophy and particularly philosophy of religion. Um, and so I do a fair bit of work responding to Christian apologists mostly, and presenting arguments for a sort of secular naturalist worldview, and responding to, I think, bad arguments for various religious doctrines. And Yeah, that's a bit about me.
So why did you write Unreasonable Faith?
Yeah, so Unreasonable Faith was my book where I've responded to the arguments of William Lane Craig, a Christian apologist. So as I said, after leaving Mormonism, I became more interested in Christian apologetics and philosophy. And at university, I uh, sort of got into touch with and became somewhat involved with the Christian club there, because I was interested, in talking to people with different viewpoints. I think it's important to um, listen to what people say who disagree with us and understand where they're coming from as well as we can. So I was involved in doing that. And over the years, I sort of heard people talking about or sharing um, videos or articles from William Lane Craig, uh, among other apologists, but he's quite prolific and influential. So he was one that sort of stuck out to me, and over the years, I read more about his material and was sort of a bit frustrated or disappointed by existing responses, like atheistic or agnostic responses to his arguments. Obviously, there are philosophers who've written papers, and there are people who've debated him and people who've produced YouTube videos and so forth. But there wasn't anyone who had really presented a single coherent, organized response to his case, to his arguments for God's existence and his particular brand of and approach to that. And so I sort of decided to take it upon myself to write a book length response to his apologetic. And so particularly focusing on the Kalam cosmological argument, which is what he's done a lot of philosophical work on, and also the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus, which is the other main topic that he's written a lot about over the years. So I also cover other topics in the book like fine tuning and the moral argument, which are two others that he talks about, and a few other things. But basically, I wanted to present a kind of coherent response to his entire case.
What do you think about his arguments in general?
Well, I think the arguments are not very good. I think the arguments are mostly convincing to people who already agree with Craig, who already, if not necessarily Christian, are maybe sympathetic to Christianity, or perhaps used to be Christians and are kind of dissatisfied with their current worldview. Because many of the arguments appeal to premises like how the universe got going, or the grounds of morality, or how to explain the origins of Christianity. Um, in each of these arguments, there's a whole bunch of premises that are really quite um, dubious, that are quite questionable. But I think that the arguments are constructed so that someone who is a Christian or is sympathetic to Christianity, or maybe used to be a Christian, won't notice all of these assumptions that have to be made, because they're just sort of things that they'll be familiar with. They'll seem plausible, and they won't really question it. They won't consider other alternatives or how other people might think about these issues. So the arguments often seem on the surface quite convincing
Hmm.
to, as I said, people who are sympathetic. So I think, and Craig is also very good at presenting them, like he's a good debater and so forth. So those things in combination, I think, make his case seem quite compelling to a lot of people. But I think, it, once you unpack it and highlight the assumptions that he's making, and highlight other potential explanations and ways of thinking about it, I think you find that his arguments are actually very weak, and don't really hold much weight at all.
Okay. What do you think about apologists in general?
Apologies. Well, um, I have a YouTube channel where I talk about a lot about apologetics
Mm-hmm.
and respond to videos and articles and talks and other things. And I'm pretty critical of the apologetics space generally, and the sort of enterprise. I mean, the basic idea of apologetics is just giving a defense of the faith or a defense of what you believe. And in that sense, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think it's good for people to think about what they believe and to critically evaluate it and to be able to provide a rigorous defense of what you believe to someone else and have a genuine conversation about it. So in that sense, I don't have an issue with that in the abstract. But how it actually works out in practice, I do have a lot of problems with because, at least, not in every case, but at least a lot of apologists who I've encountered or interacted with or seen their work, it very much seems that the conclusion comes first, and then all of the reasoning and justification comes afterwards as a way to justify what they've already decided to believe or believe for other reasons. Now, this is very much the case for William Lane Craig, who openly says that the reason he is a Christian, the reason he believes, is because of the witness of the Holy Spirit, experiences that he's had, um, and not because of any argument. In fact, he said that if all of his arguments were refuted definitively, and there were powerful arguments for atheism or against Christianity that he couldn't address, he would still stay a Christian, right? Now, not every apologist says that, but I think that ethos, that approach, that mindset is pretty sort of rampant, pretty widespread amongst apologists. And there's usually a lack of effort to try to think about things from different points of view. It's always that particular Christian denomination. I focus mostly on like Protestant apologetics, but there's other denominations too. They think about the things in their own particular way, and then they tell their stories that are convincing to them and their followers, and don't really make much of a genuine effort, usually, to seriously engage alternate explanations, alternate perspectives, and rigorously critique their own arguments. Like that's something that I think a good scholar should do, a philosopher, a scientist, or anything of that sort, is really try to critically evaluate their own position, highlight flaws, and think seriously about how to rectify those or the pros and cons of the different positions you're advocating. But apologists usually don't do this. They just try to construct ever more elaborate or ever more superficially persuasive arguments for the things that they already believe. So I really quite critical of that, and especially because apologetics is quite a big business. So Nathan and I, my friend Nathan, did a video on this where we looked at how much money there is in apologetics, especially in the US, but elsewhere in the world as well. Because there are like private Christian universities, there are seminaries, there are other institutes that fund apologetics degrees and doctoral degrees and fund research and fund people giving talks, and people make a lot of money out of books and things like this. And obviously that's true to an extent with atheism, but or humanism, but like way less. So there's a lot of money in it. It's big business. It helps to prop up a lot of people in their faith because they feel like it's well defended. They feel like, oh, if there's a question, there's someone smart who will be able to answer it, even if they themselves don't necessarily know what the answer is. It like feel better about themselves knowing that there's smart people who know the answer or purport to know the answer. And I think that is not a good situation to sort of have this big kind of complex, industrial complex, we call it, of apologetics to kind of provide a smokescreen for a lot of ordinary Christians to keep believing things that aren't, in my view, very well supported, and not serious, whilst not really seriously engaging most of the time with different perspectives. So I think overall, although in principle, like giving a defense of what you believe is not a problem for me, the way it works out in practice, I have a big problem with a lot of apologetics in practice.
So, yeah, my question will sound a little bit ignorant here, but is it fair to say that there are apologists that motivated with economic gain more than in strengthening one's faith?
Well, I mean, there's probably people everywhere who are more motivated by monetary gain than anything else. I suspect there's more of that in like the mega church celebrity pastors and things like that. There's more money even there than in apologetics. But obviously, different people have different skill sets, and so some people will go into ministry, some people will go into more of the apologetic side of things, depending on their temperament. I mean, that's not obviously specific to apologists. People everywhere are motivated by economic gain. I suspect that for apologetics, um, it's more about confirmation bias and bolstering beliefs that are very important to the apologist in
Mhm.
question, or to people they know, perhaps, as well as a bit of an ego boost. Like, it's gratifying for pretty much anyone to be asked to give talks to audiences who just agree with you and mostly affirm what you say and eat up what you say and buy your books and things like this. And again, that's not specific to apologists, but it's just that apologists have a position of having a pretty much uh, constant and almost guaranteed audience of like churches, seminaries, and institutes around the place who are always going to be eager to have their faith reaffirmed and seemingly given a rational defense. And so I absolutely think that there's that sort of monetary pecuniary side to that. And again, this is true for every worldview. It's just that
Mhm.
there's just way more money and way more fame and attention to be gotten by being a prominent Christian apologist than there is for being a prominent like counter-apologist or humanist or something like that. Like there's so few people who who make a living doing this sort of thing from an atheistic or humanist um, perspective compared to the people who do it from a Christian or even like a Muslim perspective. So I think that there is a monetary aspect to it, but I think it's more about ideology and like confirmation bias. But that's just my suspicions. I don't have evidence about that.
So if you had a chance to build a counter-apologetics ministry, would you do that?
Well, I feel like I sort of do that, but like it's always part time for me because I have I'm doing a PhD and I'll be hoping to go into academia researching other things. Um, and that's one of the challenges in responding to apologetics material is that for everything that I encounter, there's people who work full time doing apologetics, either on the research side or like more the ministry side or making YouTube videos, whatever it is. And there's just so few people who do that full time from, again, atheist, agnostic, humanist perspective. There are a few, but it's just not nearly as many. And so it makes it difficult to just stay on top of everything. I don't think I would want to do it full time, even if I could like had the money or had the support to do it. It would be nice to devote some more time to it. But there are other things that are important to me as well, um, like doing what I think of as good science and philosophy and promoting critical thinking more broadly. So I wouldn't want to do it full time, but I do think it's an important part of my ultimate goal, which is promoting science, philosophy, literacy, knowledge, critical thinking generally, helping people to think better about the world. I think religious apologetics in general leads to people thinking worse about the world. Not always, but I think in a lot of cases it does, because it digs them deeper into belief sets that aren't well supported and leads them toward down bad paths of thinking. So essentially, I think of the counter apologetics like ministry, if you want to call it that I do and others do, as supplementary to my major goals. Like my major goal is not like to deconvert people; it's to help people think better and to learn more about important issues. Um, and so, in doing that, I think counter apologetics is a part of that.
What do you think is the most dangerous ideas apologists have about maybe about science, about philosophy, or anything?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Obviously, not all apologists agree with each other, and it's important to emphasize that it's not monolithic, but there
Mhm.
are, obviously are tendencies. Um, Look, I mean, it's going to be a bit cliche, but I think in the last 10 years, it's pretty clear what the most harmful ideas are. And those are essentially any ideas that lend credence or support to like right-wing Christian nationalist belief sets or mindsets, particularly leading to supporter figures like Donald Trump. Now, I should emphasize, a lot of Christian apologists aren't going to come out and support Donald Trump. I don't. They may. Some do, some don't, some actively oppose him. But that's not what I'm talking about here directly. What I'm talking about directly is a sort of set of ideologies that I think is um, bolstered directly or indirectly by conservative Christian ideas that also contribute to people supporting Donald Trump or voting for him or supporting similar policies. So a good example of this would be anything relating to, pretty much like anything relating to sexual politics or abortion, because there's a set of views about this that relate to things like whether you think that people are more than material, like whether there's some sort of immaterial soul, what you think the ground of like personhood is or morality is, whether you think that's in the inherent properties of a human being as like a biological organism and a member of society, or whether you think it's like people being made in the image of God or something transcendent like that. And then issues about like sexual morality, what you think the basis of like gender is and the role of gender in society, whether you think that's God-given or something else. So a set of views around there then leads to people being highly motivated to oppose things like gay rights, transgender rights, abortion access, and not just to oppose it, but like to think that it's extremely important. Like, and this is where I really think that this is harmful. It's one thing to have a certain set of more conservative views about, say, abortion or gay rights, but then it's another thing to say, as I've heard quite a few more conservative Christians say, and including some apologists or defended by apologists, they'll say things like, well, look, Trump's bad on a whole bunch of things and he has a bad character, but because he's more conservative on abortion, and that is so much more of an important issue than everything else, according to their worldview, then they just sort of ignore everything else or minimize the significance of everything. And I think that's an incredibly harmful idea. But it very much is. And again, I'm not saying everyone who holds a conservative view about these sort of social issues supports it, but clearly a lot do. There's a lot of evidence for that in voting and surveys and other things. So I think that's a particularly harmful set of ideas that lead people to think that the need to oppose like aspects of they need to oppose progressive stances on issues surrounding abortion and sexual politics leads to a sort of a license to support anyone in any circumstance who will go along with their preferred positions here, regardless of regardless of any other circumstances or any other considerations. So that's a major concern that I have. And another related issue is a distrust of scientific authority or really any type of secular authority. Like we saw this a lot in we see this with things like distrust of scientists about evolution, about climate change, which although it's not directly a religious issue, it does correlate a lot with like conservative religious attitudes, and then with like vaccines and health advice with the pandemic and afterwards. So a lot of conservative Christians have degrees of distrust in mainstream science because often it is felt to be in tension with what the Bible teaches. Again, not everyone holds this view, but the attitude is certainly common. And there's still a lot of more conservative apologists who, if they're not outright young earth creationists, maybe they're old earth creationists, or maybe they critique other aspects of science that potentially conflict with the Bible. Or like neuroscience is another area, a lot of implausible views being promoted about issues relating to the nature of consciousness, for example, and the mind. So I think that general distrust and rejection of science to varying degrees is also quite harmful because it leads to, as I said, these positions like about vaccine denial and creationism and global warming denial. And in general, just the distrust of the tendency to trust religious authority over expertise and critical thinking based on like science and critical reasoning, and the desire to say like, this nation is founded on the Bible, and then we should derive our ethics from the Bible and things like that, which is really just a deference to authority rather than thinking that we should, like having an enlightenment idea of thinking these things through critically ourselves. So there's a whole bunch of ideas which are not necessarily endorsed by all apologists or directly taught, but I think there are a cluster of things that tend to go together and are often supported by or bolstered by apologists, which are ultimately very harmful for society.
Okay, I'm going a little bit off track here. So I want to ask you about this. Is the effect of anti-science already felt now in the West that Donald Trump re-elected?
Well, Trump appointed an anti-vaxxer to the head of the Federal Health Agency. I forget the exact name, but the FDA was it, or whatever it was. I mean,
Mm.
do you really need to say anything else? I mean, Trump avowedly is critical of vaccines and is avowedly critical of climate change and dismissive of expertise pretty much everywhere. Um, so I don't think that all of that is like religiously motivated, but it seems to at the very least correlate with and is associated with um, distrust of secular expertise, which comes along with conservative religious attitudes, and is bolstered by certain sets of apologetic teachings. Like there are apologists who talk about, they'll say things like, "Well, the mind is not material, right? So there's a spiritual realm, there's souls and spirits and other things," and then they talk about then that leads into beliefs about spiritual warfare, the idea that there are like demons who can possess people or who can influence society in various ways, and that we're in this sort of spiritual warfare between the force of evil and the force of darkness, and then force of light and the force of darkness, and then they can identify, oh well, this political party or this type of people or this class in society is the being manipulated by evil forces, evil spirits, and then we need to fight back against that. And then you can see how this feeds into Christian nationalism or other ideas. This doesn't just happen in the West, by the way. I think that there's analogous movements in other countries, but particularly
Yeah.
in the West, yeah, we absolutely see this, and I
Mm.
think it's become more. I mean, this sort of things existed for a long time, but I think it's become more influential and prominent in the last 10 years or so, and Donald Trump's a big part of that.
Yeah, I'm in the East, so things like
Yeah,
spiritual battle and something like this already something common here, even believed by most of the
yeah,
government's official here. So that's something normal for us. But in the
yeah.
West, it's something else. I mean, for all I know, that Western people are much, much, much more rational than us, the Easterners. So it's does many Western people believe that kind of story about spiritual battles, something like that? Now that Donald Trump reelected?
Well, so I don't know that more people believe it than they used to. So there are sort of global
Mm.
surveys that ask people about these sorts of things, like belief in spirits or magic and things like this. And there's still fairly high degrees of belief in the West, but from what I've read, not as high as in other regions. Particularly, like it tends to be correlated with economic and social development. So, like belief in witchcraft, for example, and the power of magic is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, from what I've read, and then it tends to be lowest in like Western Europe. Um, but I think that these surveys don't capture everything, because it's not just whether you ask some. It's not just an issue of asking someone and they say on a survey, yes or no, I believe in this. Because if you do, like a lot of people in the West will say they believe in ghosts and things like this. But belief in, say, ghosts or spirits, it just doesn't play a big role in um, Western political or social discourse, like public discourse. Um, and actually, I think part of this, interestingly, is because like things like the media and academia and the civil service, corporations, um, have traditionally played such a major role in kind of regulating and shaping public discourse and like decisions about public policy. Um, and these spheres tend to be dominated by educated elites. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, but I think it does have certain implications that you tend to have a um, it tends to be a system which diminishes uh, certain diminishes the influence of certain more popular, but I would say sort of superstitious or less more traditional belief systems. A good example of this that I like to give is if you look in Europe, right? In Europe, pretty much no major political party that I'm aware of supports the introduction of the death penalty. The only European country that still practices the death penalty, as far as I know, is Belarus. But like all of the European Union countries, they don't have the death penalty. They're not allowed to. It's against the European Convention on Human Rights, I think it's called. And so it's just not even on the table, right? And that reflects a consensus of elites that there's no like good public policy reason. It's philosophically indefensible in the modern age to have the death penalty, right? But if you ask the populace, if you ask people on surveys, as they still do periodically, would you support the death penalty for murder and things like this? You still get between like 40 to 60%, depending on the country, of people saying, yeah, I would support that. And I think that this is just an example of what I mean, that there is often a big difference between if you ask the citizenry about what they think about some scientific issue or political topic or a human rights issue, and then if you ask people in a position of who essentially elites in the sense of having influence and education typically is part of that. not that one would say elites are always right, but the point I'm making here is that I think that traditionally that has been um, it does serve to mitigate the influence of belief systems like, belief in magic or spirits or anti-science views or anti-vaccination views would be another one, right? Um, so what I think we've seen in the last 10 years in the West is this dominance of traditional elites like, academia, government civil service, elite scientific institutions like the World Health Organization be an example of this. We've seen they're still very powerful and influential, but we've seen their public legitimacy attacked much more explicitly and much more vociferously, particularly on social media. And we've seen a new class of, or at least newly influential class of political actors like Donald Trump, but also there's many sort of copycats in Europe and elsewhere who base their legitimacy not on any type of expertise or qualifications, but just on like telling it how it is and giving people what they want and emotional appeals to things that people are worried about. So instead of having a rational policy about healthcare or about climate change or dealing with immigration, it's all based on what sort of the folk intuitions are of the or a lot more based on the folk intuitions of people who have opinions about these topics but aren't really well informed about them. So this is a roundabout way of saying that I don't know that if you ask the average person, there's much more rationality in the West than elsewhere. Like maybe a bit because there is more general education. Like there are some differences, again, if you look at the surveys. But I think a big part of it is in the institutions. Like traditionally in the West, we do have a history, like since the Enlightenment, of having like secular and democratic institutions where to a significant extent there is the idea of expertise based on rigorous study and qualifications and experience, and not decision making purely based on something like biblical law. Like in much of the Middle East, there's at least some notion that the law of the land is shaped directly on Sharia law, but in the West, that's pretty much doesn't exist, or at least until very recently. Even if there are still some countries that have official churches in like England, but it doesn't play much of a role in the same way. So yeah, I think that traditionally those institutions have helped to I would argue improve the quality of public policy and public discourse and the influence of rationality in Western countries, not just in Western countries, but like focusing on that. But we're seeing that break down in recent years because of it seems the decreasing legitimacy of these institutions and the increasing ability of demagogues and populists to appeal to the sort of baser emotions and fears and prejudices and ignorance of large fractions of the population.
Okay. So, how do you challenge institutions that don't use rationality in educating or informing the citizens? Because, of course, this is a different battle from countering apologetics, right?
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult. I mean, again, this was sort of what the Enlightenment project was, right? So challenging existing religious and political institutions and their control of society that were not based or not substantially based on rationality, but were often based on traditional, just sort of naked power. I think that transparency is important here, and we still do broadly in the West have freedom of speech. There have been some challenges to that, but I think we still do have that to a significant extent, and it's important to use that to highlight the problems with institutions that are not based on science, or decisions that are not based on science, or just good reasoning, or thinking things through carefully. Now the challenge is, of course, that a lot of people don't want to listen to that. It's particularly difficult with social media, that people often only see things that they already agree with, like from outlets that they agree with, and there is a lot of sensationalism and a lot of deliberate misinformation, misinformation or disinformation that's spread. So I don't have any silver bullet for dealing with that. I think that part of the one thing you need to do is just have as much of you need to have voices in the space, right? Because if you have a discourse where you have 10 people talking about how global warming is a hoax and how the COVID was a hoax, and how immigration is like the worst thing that's ever happened to the West and it's going to destroy Western civilization and blah, and all of this other all this other nonsense, and you only have one person attempting to refute that, then they're just going to tend to be their voice is going to tend to be washed out in the discourse. And so, like, in a sense, sheer numbers matters, which is why I think it's important to, even as just one person who doesn't have particularly big influence, I have a little bit, but not that much, I still feel it's important to do this because every I think, well, not every voice, but every well-informed voice can make a difference. So part of it is just more people need to contribute and share their ideas about where they have some expertise, or standing up for rationality or critical thinking for science if and when it's appropriate to do so. I think another thing that's very important is to be able to communicate ideas clearly to people. And that's where I think a lot of these elite institutions that I was talking about, that sort of previously and still to an extent, but to a lesser extent, dominated the Western economies and societies and polities, is and part of the reason why they've lost a lot of legitimacy is because they've failed to clearly and persuasively communicate the benefits of the policies, or the rationale of the policies that they promote. Like an example would be vaccination or mask wearing with the pandemic. I think that there was a lot of people trying to promote that sort of information, but I think that there were a lot of problems with how that was presented, and the way that scientific expertise is presented in the media commonly. It's often a scientist is taken as just an authority, right? And then they're contrasted with other authorities, whereas that I think is not. I mean, a scientist who has expertise in an area should be granted a certain amount of deference, but it's not because of their authority as such. It's because their authority is reflective of what the evidence shows, and that needs to be understood, I think, more clearly than it is. And so that's just one example. But in lots of areas, I think that there's been there just hasn't been enough of an effort to really communicate what are often increasingly complex ideas to ordinary people. And I mean, the way I talk about like ordinary people or the citizenry may sound a bit condescending, but I like, the point is, I don't expect that everyone's going to have a university education or be very knowledgeable about these things, and it's important that people who, like me, who do have that background and who have the opportunity to learn about these things and study them, that we are able to communicate that effectively. Because if it's our job essentially to do that, and if I think we haven't been doing it very well, and we're reaping the results of that. So the way we deal with institutions that aren't responsive to science or reason, I think, is to critique them publicly, but we have to do that like consistently with as many voices as we can gather to do that. And we also have to do that in a way that's persuasive to kind of ordinary people, not just to other people who are like us.
I see. So, what would your response be to people that say science can't answer everything?
Can't answer everything?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say it depends how you define science. So this is always a tricky issue, because there's sort of a narrow and a broad notion of science. If we think of science in a narrow sense, it's basically like physics, chemistry, biology, like geology, and a few other areas like that, then I agree. Obviously, those fields can't answer everything. Like, there's heaps of questions that lie outside of those disciplines. But I personally define science, or at least usually think of it in a much broader way. I think of science as essentially a rigorous and systematic effort to understand the world using the techniques of reasoning and evidence, and sound epistemic practices, which include things like seeking out alternative points of view and thinking about the ways you could be wrong, and thinking through carefully the logic of arguments and trying to be clear, and seeking out disconfirmatory evidence, things like that. Sometimes people call this the scientific method, but I do think that that's a bit mistaken, because there's not really a single scientific method. There's sort of a set of methods, and you can't like give an equation for it or an algorithm for it, but there's a set of broad practices. And And I don't think these are unique to science. Like I think that history practices these, or historians, when they're doing work well, practice these techniques to understand the past. Lawyers do this, or like investigators when they're trying to understand and work through the logic of a case. Um, uh, Medical doctors do this when they're trying to diagnose and treat a patient. And I think philosophers do this, at least should do this, when they're thinking about how to understand difficult topics, like about morality or the nature of the mind and things like that. So, in this broader sense, I think that science, understood broadly, in German there's a word Wissenschaft, which is kind of like science, but it's also broader, and so I kind of like that broader notion of science.
Mhm.
I think that is capable of answering any question that can be answered. Perhaps there are some questions that don't have an answer, in which case, well, obviously nothing can answer them. But if a question is answerable, even in principle, then I think that broader notion of science is really the only way we have to answer them.
So have you ever been accused of scientism?
Oh, yes, many
And how
times.
do you
And part of
respond to
this,
that?
yeah, well, part of this reflects the difference that I said between how we understand what science is. Because when I say science can answer
Mhm.
every answerable question, I'm talking about in the broad sense, not in the sense of like just the physical sciences or something like that. So as I mentioned, I would include like good work in philosophy and history, and the social sciences as well, like economics, political science, psychology, sociology. I would include all of that as part of science, as long as it's using good methods. And not all inquirers or researchers do. I think there is a lot of sloppy research, but that's in all disciplines. So yeah, pretty much I would say that whether you want to accuse me of scientism is I'm a little bit indifferent to that. I think that really only holds by if you're taking quite a narrow view of science. And there are some people who do this. They'll pretty much say, yeah, it's like physics and chemistry and nothing else really counts. And let's say social sciences, they're not real sciences or something like this. Now, I don't hold that view and I don't defend that. And I think that you can characterize that view as a form of sort of scientism. But if scientism is just being used as a pejorative term to critique what I'm saying about the what I think of as the nature of good inquiry and how we answer questions, then I mean it's just really a label. It's not really an argument against anything.
Yeah. So you said earlier about sloppy research. What is the difference
Mm.
between sloppy and good research?
Well, the short answer is that sloppy research uses poor methods and good research uses good methods. That might sound like a kind of
Mm-hmm.
meaningless answer, but I actually think that it highlights an important thing, which is that the difference between essentially good and bad research or sloppy and careful research, it's not about the answer. It's not about what you find, nor is it about what discipline or area you're studying. It's all, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion, it's all about the methods, how the research was done. Um, and that I think is an important insight because a lot of people do tend to focus, like in scientism, for example, they'll focus on superficial things like are you using statistics or mathematics? Or are you talking about things that you can measure with a fancy machine? Like a good example is when people are talking about the mind, that they often have, or human behavior, they often have this idea that it's only scientific if you can like measure it on a brain scan or something like this. But measuring something with a survey is also science, right? And it just depends on what you're trying to measure and whether the methods are appropriate for that, and not whether it's with a brain scan or just by talking to someone and writing down what they say, right? So this insight that it's about the methods and not the discipline or the superficial aspects of how you do it, or like what machinery you use, or whether it's experimental or non-experimental. I think all of these things are red herrings. What matters is whether the methods are sound. And in terms of answering that question, well, what determines whether methods are sound? Um, it, the general, like there's a general answer which is not very specific by nature, and that is that good scientific research or good research generally needs to be carefully focused on answering specific questions. Or I mean, you can also do exploratory research where like you collect data, but you need to have a fairly clear idea about what you're doing, and then think about what are the different ways that I could be wrong, or I could be missing things, or I could go down the wrong path. I could make an incorrect assumption. And there's many ways you can do that, and it depends on the specific application. But you need to be very consciously thinking about that and trying to rule those out. And so that's one way you can do that is by running an experiment, right? The whole point of an experiment is that you try to control for various confounding variables. And that is an example of applying the scientific mindset. But you don't have to do an experiment. That's just one way that you can try to mitigate these different confounds, or essentially ways that you can be wrong. A lot of bad research doesn't do this. It doesn't adequately think or at all think about how could I be wrong? What are the other ways of looking at this? And this is why a lot of apologetics, I think, is very bad research. It's poor inquiry, because they just sort of come up with an explanation and then talk about how good it is as an explanation, and then use a lot of religious platitudes without seriously trying to investigate, well, what are the other potentials here? What are the confounds? What are the factors that I've neglected? And that's how you do good research. So you really have to be carefully thinking about how you could be wrong and what you've missed out. And the other thing I think that's really critical of good research is it needs to be careful and systematic, not haphazard, just sort of pulling things and cherry picking things that support what you already believe. So that's important too. And it needs to be empirically grounded. And that can be quite, it doesn't, so, I've said before that I think philosophy counts as sort of scientific, but even philosophy should have some sort of empirical content, although it may be very broad empirical content, like very general observations about language or about parts of the world. But I think that good research should make connection with the world, with observable aspects of reality in some capacity. There are some people who just seem to be totally disinterested in sort of testing ideas or in evaluating them empirically, and I think that that's not really good inquiry either. So yeah, but basically there's a set of general characteristics like checking that you're wrong and for confounding factors, for being empirically minded, and for being sort of rigorous and systematic. And then how you actually deploy those in practice is really specific. It depends on the exact question you're trying to answer and the types of approaches you're using. And that just comes down to like good methodology, good design of your research, and carrying out the design appropriately. There's no like algorithm I can give for that. So there's general principles and then there's specific applications. But I think that you can often recognize and distinguish good from bad research by looking for these different factors.
So, is there any good research about the resurrection in general? Maybe resurrection of Jesus or any other kind of people?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the focus is on Jesus because, well, that's what people are interested in because of prior religious convictions. Yeah, there is good research, but there's people coming at this question from different avenues. There's like biblical scholars, so they're looking at mainly biblical texts and understanding how those came to be and who the authors were, what they understood at the time, who they were writing for, what they meant. There is kind of anthropological research, which tends to look at like new religious movements. There are some people who sort of studied ancient Christianity in that context, but more that's looking at religious traditions today, and how they think about miracle claims or how spiritual beliefs develop. That's kind of relevant. There's cognitive science and psychology, which sort of looks at how people form their beliefs, things like eyewitness testimony and the reliability of that, and how people maintain beliefs in spite of disconfirming evidence. So I cite a bunch of that sort of evidence in my book. So that's sort of relevant as well. But the thing is, so there's a lot of evidence that's relevant. What there really isn't is any sort of, outside apologetics itself, any sort of academic work looking to like investigate historical or contemporary miracles and decide whether they're actual miracles or not. As far as I know, that research simply does not exist. Like there are no academics who are investigating miracles and like saying, yes, this was supernatural or no, it was not. There's no one who's going to pay for that sort of research, essentially, because the only people who care about this are the religious traditions in question, and they're only interested in validating things that they already believe in. And yeah, so there's, and often researchers who approach this from a more anthropological or like sociological lens like to be sympathetic to the peoples they study, and so they typically resist making like very strong claims about their beliefs being false or something like that. Like sometimes they do. It depends a bit on the case and how harmful the beliefs are. But for the most part, that's just not the sort of thing that anthropologists or sociologists of religion do. they may describe descriptively what people believe and how they practice like faith healings and things like that, but they're not in the business of like debunking. So really what you get is people in the skeptical movement, like James Randi, for example, who investigated, I mean, he's dead now, but he had a prize where he challenged people to prove any sort of paranormal or supernatural event under controlled conditions. And there are other people like that who, like skeptics or atheists, who investigate these sorts of things and provide explanations based on scientific principles. But this is not just true for religion, it's true for other things as well, like paranormal events, parapsychology, near-death experiences. I mean, sometimes you do have some medical doctors talking a bit about that, but like for the most part, most of these things, whether it's paranormal or whether it's supernatural events or miracle claims, they're not taken very seriously by most mainstream academia, and there's just not a lot of research on them. Certainly not from the point of view of like, are they veridical or not? Like, do they point to something transcendental or supernatural? And so it's, in that sense, there's very little good research on this. Again, most of it comes from true believers. It's just people trying to defend what they already believe. And there's useful stuff that people who true believers or apologists do. It's not like it's all rubbish, but I think overall the scholarship doesn't, it's not conducted using the best methods, because the primary purpose is to defend a pre-existing belief and not have an honest investigation, at least for the most part. Again, there are individual exceptions, but I think overall that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write my book and talk a lot about the resurrection and do a lot of research there. It's just because there isn't very much on this that's not that takes the claim seriously, but at the same time doesn't just try to defend a pre-existing belief.
Okay, let's get back to the book and the counter-apologetics movement. Is there
Sure.
any particular God arguments that you think is good or hard to challenge?
Sorry, that I think are good or hard to challenge, you said.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that there are some that are hard to challenge, although that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good. It can mean, for example, that they're very complicated, and so there's just a lot of issues that you have to sort of wade through. But let me answer the question first about whether I think there are any arguments that are good. In terms of like rationally, convincing to a rational or an appropriately informed observer or intellect, I would say no, I don't think so. I don't want to claim expertise on every argument that anyone's ever made, but I think most of the typical ones are not really very good at all, and even some of the less typical ones that I've encountered are often even worse. Most arguments for the existence of God rely on very, in my view, implausible assumptions, and a failure to consider alternate possibilities. And when you combine those two things, I think that you see repeatedly how these sort of arguments fail. Yeah, and then so the question about whether there are any that are hard to challenge, I think arguments can be difficult to challenge often because you just have to, there's a lot you have to do to explain what's wrong with them. Like the Kalam cosmological argument would be a good example of this. I think that argument is hard to challenge in a way because it's quite complex, and superficially it seems quite persuasive, at least to a lot of people. The idea that, well, things that begin need to have a cause, and the universe began, right? So it must have had a cause. There are ways you can challenge those that I think ultimately show that both of those premises are highly suspect, but at least I've not found ways that are easy to do very quickly and convincing to a lot of people who don't necessarily have a lot of background in science or philosophy. So I think that that's ultimately what makes a good apologetic argument, in the sense that it's superficially convincing and hard to refute quickly or convincingly to a lay audience. William Lane Craig's moral argument is a good example of this. William Lane Craig's moral argument has just absolutely no academic credibility at all. He just makes a whole bunch of assertions about morality and then sort of claims that, well, it must be God, therefore. It's a joke of an argument. He's never even really bothered to publish much about it, like in any academic journal or anything, which is not true of his other arguments. Like his Kalam argument, he's published a lot about that, but the moral argument, no. But I mention it because I think he keeps using it in debates because it's just convincing to a lot of people who haven't really thought about the issue very much or don't know much about meta-ethics. Because he just makes a whole bunch of appeals which to a certain audience seem plausible and which take a while to explain why they're wrong. This is very similar to responding to like creationists, for example, or global warming deniers. There's often things that seem superficially convincing, but and are quick to say, but then take a long time to unpack. So I think a lot of apologetics is like this, and part of what I try to do is develop more intuitive, easy to understand, and well, I say quicker. A lot of my videos are quite long, but I am interested in thinking about more concise ways of articulating what's wrong with some of these apologetics arguments. But it's often challenging because they raise so many complex issues, but only deal with them very superficially. And I think to do the issues justice, often you just need to give a lot more background and you need to introduce complexity. But the apologist often deliberately doesn't do that because they don't want to get into the nuance or the complexity. They just want a superficial understanding which will support their worldview. So yeah, I would say a lot of apologetics arguments, particularly the widely used ones, are sort of superficially convincing and therefore often hard to respond to, but are not actually good at all, like in terms of that they should convince a reasoned inquirer, or that they're ultimately like logically sound or anything.
So have you ever gone to any debates?
In-person debates? Yeah,
Yeah.
I've attended a few. I've participated in a few as well. A couple with Christians, couple with Muslims over the years, as well as a bunch of online ones. Yeah, so and I've listened to many more like recorded ones.
So what were your experience in debating them?
Well, sort of what I said. Like, I mean, it depends on the person. There are some apologists whom I've talked to who are quite nice to talk to and will have a reasonable conversation with you, and there are others who just have their script and will run through the script, and usually that involves just raising a whole bunch of issues, like you can't explain this, you can't explain that, and
Hmm.
then you having to be in the position of patiently unpacking and explaining and giving the background about all of these complex issues. Um, so yeah, I'd say my experience is mixed, but overall, I still think debates have their place. That they're still useful. It's a way to communicate to people. It's often more engaging, and because people have limited attention spans, the sort of time limits are helpful too. But there's of course a lot of downsides. But I would say my experience overall with debates is more positive than negative
Hmm.
on
Okay.
balance.
All right. So let's talk about the dynamic between the rational, let's say that, and then the believers. I'm not saying that the believers aren't rational, but let's say that
Yeah,
we are the skeptic one. Maybe we're the skeptic one.
yeah, sure.
Um, are we winning here? I mean, okay, are we in the right track where people start to start to think more rationally even more? If we don't, what do you think the efforts required to to overcome defeat or anything like that?
Well, I think whether we're winning depends on what your time frame is that you're looking at things. I think if you look at the trajectory, let's focus on the West. If you look at the trajectory of society over the last, say, 3 centuries, um, it does seem like society is much more skeptical, rational, and scientifically informed, less superstitious, less based on religious dogma than it was 3 centuries ago, or even 2 centuries ago, or even 1 century ago. Really, I think on the scale of last 10 years, no, I think it's gone backwards. But I do have hope for the future. I think there are still trends that we see, like younger generations are less religious than older generations. Younger generations are more likely to believe in the importance of dealing with climate change, for example. I don't actually know if vaccine skepticism differs by age. I haven't actually looked into that. But in general, from data that I've seen, younger generations are more amenable to they're less likely to accept traditional religious dogma and more likely to be accepting of um, ideas from humanism and ideas from science, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're super rational themselves, but at least maybe the influence of that traditional the traditional institutions is less on them. Is the influence on them is less, and so I think overall society, like taking the long view again, last 10 years has been bad, and the next few will probably get even worse. But taking the long view, I still think there's reason to be optimistic. Access to education still continues to increase over the world, and also even within developed societies. So tertiary education, education online. There is, of course, the challenge of misinformation and disinformation, which is a big issue. I do hope and think that we'll get better at dealing with that. And Western democratic liberal society has faced many challenges before and overcome them. And I think that this is a very broad issue, which I can't talk about all aspects of here. I think that there are mechanisms within our societies to be able to deal with these challenges, but it will take a lot of effort, and it will take, I think, it will take new technologies, new social institutions, new approaches to be able to better communicate about complex ideas to people who don't necessarily have the relevant background, and help them to understand in a way that makes sense to them, and cut through a lot of the misinformation and emotional appeals and things like that. So, yeah, I think short term, no, I think things are going backwards. Longer term, I think things are still going in the right direction, and I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic.
Last question. What's the next book that you're planning on writing?
Well, I have a clear answer to that. So I have been working for a few years on a book defending naturalism, or physicalism, materialism. I don't distinguish between those. So the book will discuss a few main topics. So one is the nature of the material world, so a bit of philosophy of physics, and the notion of reductionism and how we understand the relationship between different branches of inquiry and different parts of reality. I'm going to be talking about metaethics, so where morality comes from and how we can understand that as being a sort of a social, natural process that doesn't require appeals to anything transcendent, that's based on the value of human beings and well-being and ability to suffer and flourish, and doesn't require appeal to God or anything like that. I'll be talking about the nature of abstract objects like mathematical objects and logic and things like that, and explain why we don't need to postulate any kind of Platonic realm or anything beyond the natural world, the material world, to understand these sorts of things. And I'll be talking finally about the mind and consciousness and language, and how all of these things can be understood from a purely material point of view. We don't need to postulate any kind of soul or spirits or anything like that. So basically, the book is focusing on a number of areas where traditionally people have argued that, well, there must be more than just this physical world, this material world, and arguing that, no, in fact, we don't need to postulate anything else, that we have good explanations within science and philosophy for all of these things that are more than sufficient. And so I see that as sort of a complement to some of the counter-apologetics work that I've done, which is more reactive to Christians defending their worldview, whereas in here I'm trying to outline and defend parts of my own worldview, and trying to do so in a way that's hopefully relatively easy to understand, and provides an attractive alternative to a religious or a more conservative religious point of view. So I don't know when that will be finished. Probably won't come out for another couple of years, but that is what I'm working on at the moment.
Can I ask you just one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Who is your favorite philosopher? And if you had a chance to have a conversation with him or her, what are the topics would be?
Well, my favorite philosopher is David Hume. I really respect his skeptical attitude and his naturalism, and a lot of the work that he did on epistemology and other areas, especially at his time when it was not really safe to be too critical of religion or avowedly atheist. So he's definitely my favorite philosopher. In terms of what I would talk to him about, I've never really, him being centuries dead, I've never thought about this directly. I would definitely be interested to hear his thoughts about developments in society and philosophy since his death. It would be interesting to ask him what he thinks about things like quantum mechanics, how that fit into how he thought about the natural world, to ask him what he thinks about the place of religion in today's society and how that compared to in his day. Yeah, I'd probably just ask him about a whole bunch of recent ideas in science and philosophy. One of his big ideas is about it's called Humanism about laws of nature and causation, which is the idea that it's a regularity theory. That causation is not kind of a fundamental force or something. It's really just a description of the way things tend to happen as making observations of regularities. And I'd be interested to hear what he has to say about how he thinks about that in the light of recent developments in philosophy and science and other things. That would be a particular thing that would be cool to ask him about. But yeah, no shortage of things that would be cool to talk to him about. I should say, to answer the question a different way, another of my favorite philosophers is Graham Oppy, and he is very much alive. In fact, he lives here in Victoria, where I live, and I have met him on a couple of occasions and talked a bit about counter-apologetic stuff. So he's done a lot of work. He's published critiquing William Lane Craig, for example, and other apologists. So I really respect him as well.
Right. So, James Fodor, thanks so much. Thank you very much.
No worries, pleasure.